In this episode, we are going over all of the potential fantasy football breakouts at the running back and wide receiver position for 2024. We'll discuss whether or not we see that happening for some popular breakout candidates, but also a few that you might not have considered. I'm Faraz Siddiqi. This is the Upper Hand Fantasy Podcast. Let's start with some potential running back breakouts. I think Achane is obviously in line for a breakout year. The hope is that he stays healthy, and the assumption is that he gets more playing time. He had only 4 games with more than 50% of snaps last year, only 1 game with more than 50% of the rushing attempts. Still, he had 4 top 5 finishes. He averaged 17.8 PPR fantasy points per game, and he was the RB5 as a result. Now, is he worth picking at his ADP? That's a different question. I think he is worth chasing personally, given how historically efficient he was on a yards per carry basis, after contact, missed tackles forced, yards per route run, literally everything that matters. He was at or near the top of the league. And then you account for the scheme that he's in, the offensive environment that he's in. Everything's just kind of coming together for him going into 2024. Apparently, he bulked up a bit. That's what you want to hear, so he can absorb some more punishment, especially we know that he's not the biggest back in the world. But the word is that he's going to be more involved in the receiving game, and that's great. That's what we want. Now, I'm not really going to assume that he got hurt last year just because of his size. I find a hard time clinging onto that idea. It's hard to pinpoint the fact that he got hurt because of his size in particular, but he did bulk, which is good. I do think the volume is going to go up for Achane. His efficiency can definitely come down, and that would be just fine. He can still have a monster year for fantasy because of the talent, because of the offensive environment. He scored 3 times on 5 carries inside the 5-yard line last year, so there is some confidence that he could line up there just fine as well, and it might not be just the Mostert show inside the 5-yard line. I think the main thing it comes down to is the competition, right? I mentioned Raheem Mostert, Jaylen Wright. I don't think they use all 3 backs. I think they use 2, one of them being Mostert, and then one of them being Achane. If one of those guys gets hurt, I think that's when Jaylen Wright steps in. If Mostert ends up being a shell of himself at age 32, which is very possible, and Achane stays healthy, we're talking no question league winner here when we're talking about Achane. I'm still willing to take shots on Mostert at his ADP because of what he showed last year. He was very efficient last year, but we've seen running backs take a serious dive off a cliff when they get older, right? And 32 years old is very old for a running back. I get that the price is relatively high on Achane, but I'm still in on him because of that ceiling that he represents, and it's possible that he's being drafted closer to his floor than his ceiling, unless you're projecting that Mostert is going to be the main guy. Personally, I don't necessarily agree with that. All right, next running back, Isiah Pacheco. He's probably my favorite high-end value running back in drafts this year. I know he was a low-end RB1 last year, so maybe he doesn't qualify for a breakout, but I think he can go absolutely nuclear this year. So like super breakout, maybe. He has no competition for touches in that backfield this year. Jerick McKinnon isn't on the team anymore, and without McKinnon last year, Pacheco averaged 21.1 PPR fantasy points per game, which would have been good for the overall RB3 on the year. In those games, 21.6 opportunities per game, almost 100 total yards per game, more than a touchdown score per game. On a Patrick Mahomes-led offense, he was top 10 in both red zone rushing attempts and red zone targets last year among all running backs, and that was with McKinnon getting only 1 less red zone target than Pacheco last year. Clear opportunity there for Pacheco to add on to his totals. And Pacheco's success last year wasn't just because of volume, it wasn't just because of a great offensive environment. He was pretty efficient overall individually in the run game. He was also 6th in targets per route run as well among all qualifying running backs. So if McKinnon is going to relinquish his 33% route participation that he had last year, we could see more targets going Pacheco's way as well. All right, moving on. There were 2 running backs who were extremely efficient to start their careers over the past couple seasons. Tyjae Spears, Jaylen Warren. Both of them are in timeshares this year, obviously, but I think both have a chance to break out with more opportunity this season. I think Tyjae is very good. I'm not so sure that Will Levis will be aiming to target the running back at a tremendous rate, given how much he likes to throw the ball downfield, and he has some weapons downfield now. I'm sure he'll be coached to do it at some point, but I do think that Warren has a clear path to breaking out this year. He was the RB22 in fantasy points per game last year, top 15 in both points per snap and points per touch, and I think he'll get more of both of those this year because of how efficient he was last year in the run game and the receiving game. I mentioned this before too, but new Steelers offensive coordinator and former Falcons OC Arthur Smith was not only a run-heavy play caller, but he was willing to take so much away from Bijan Robinson. I'm willing to bet that he's willing to take a lot from Najee Harris as well, potentially even more. And the thing is, Warren is the better pass-catching option. Bijan ran a route on 70% of dropbacks last year, only second behind Christian McCaffrey. He ranked third in target share, third behind CMC and Breece Hall. Warren was fifth. Warren also ranked fourth in targets per route run last year as well, and he is the guy in the Steelers' backfield who's the primary pass-catching running back. You look at Russell Wilson last year, he ranked last in first read throw percentage, who by the way would be George Pickens in this case on most plays, and Russell Wilson ranked first in check down percentage. And given the fact that the Steelers really have one bona fide weapon and one target earner in George Pickens, we could be seeing a lot of the same this year with a lot of those secondary targets going to Warren. All Warren really needs is maybe 20 more catches to hit that 80 catch threshold, a little more work in the run game behind that improved offensive line, and a little more touchdown equity to be fantasy RB1. And by the way, this is 2 years in a row now with Warren being at the very top of the efficiency charts, and he's going into year 3 at age 25, which is the age apex for running backs. Now, what about Zamir White? I think there is a path where he is a workhorse and where he could break out, but there is also a large range of outcomes here. He definitely filled in nicely as a workhorse at the end of last year, one of only 2 running backs who had 80 or more carries over the last 4 weeks of the season. He was very good after contact, not really good making guys miss, like was pretty low in missed tackles force, was good at creating some big plays with that speed. And you combine that with how brawly he got. He's absolutely massive at this point in a good way. Could be a nice combo, right? He doesn't have the talent profile necessary to really project him for this huge season. He doesn't have a pass catching history worth taking note of, but the depth chart isn't all that, right? It seems like Alexander Mattison could be just a backup, right? There's some mixed words from their head coach, Antonio Pierce. We'll see like what kind of role he ends up playing. Maybe he's involved a little bit, but there is definitely a path for White to be very solid for fantasy. The Raiders themselves are projected to be one of the lowest scoring teams and a team that isn't planning on running a ton of plays per game based on their offensive coordinator, so I don't know that the upside is super high for White this year, but I can see him being maybe a solid RB2, maybe a low-end RB2 this year, because that defense could keep them in games to allow them to continue to run the ball. Is it a breakout year for White? For him, probably. For us, it could be, I'm not drafting a whole lot of him personally. Like, these type of running backs can hit, but this type of running back situation is a story as old as time. For me, probably best to avoid. All right, moving to the wide receiver position. There are 2 big names we've been waiting on, right? Garrett Wilson, Drake London. But both of them get huge quarterback upgrades this year. Both quarterbacks coming off of Achilles injuries. Aaron Rodgers' version of the injury isn't as concerning because it's his left foot, while Kirk injured his right foot, which is the foot that right-handed quarterbacks kind of plant on when generating their throwing power. The question is whether those downfield bombs will be there this year for Drake London. I think that's a genuine question. I think Darnell Mooney also is wondering the same thing. I'm not overly worried about it. I think both Garrett Wilson and Drake London are in line for big years. Garrett has already proved himself in a big way despite terrible quarterback situations over the last 2 years. 2 1,000-yard seasons, 2 seasons with at least 80 catches, right? 195 catch season last year. He proved to be an extreme target earner, 30% target share last year. Only Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, and Devontae Adams received a higher target share than Garrett Wilson last year. This is the same offense, right? But now we have a quarterback who can actually sling it, and he also has a history of funneling a top-heavy distribution towards his top weapon. It was Devontae Adams, and now it'll be Garrett Wilson. We're looking at a potential top 5 finish for Garrett Wilson this year. He can easily see 1,400 yards, 12 touchdowns. And by the way, if you haven't seen his reception perception charting, Matt Harmon did a great job with that. Please go take a look. He's an elite separator. He has run after the catch ability on top of that as a big cherry on top. Now with London, it's pretty simple, right? No more Arthur Smith, and also now has a capable quarterback who was able to provide Justin Jefferson with what he needed to be the overall fantasy wide receiver 1. The offense coming over from Sean McVay's system is another great thing, right? Especially when you see the success of Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, Puka Nacua. Drake London's success on his route tree matches up with what Puka did very well on those in-breaking routes, those digs. Speaking of which, you look at his reception perception profile, which highlights how good of a separator he is. He does profile as a number 1 wide receiver, a very good separator who has a big body for those contested catches and red zone grabs. A top 12 finish is definitely in the cards for London, and if McVay's system can be replicated in Atlanta and they put an emphasis on what London does well, there's even room for upside. 1,250 yards maybe, 10 touchdowns after a combined 6 touchdowns over his first 2 seasons, that would be welcomed. I think we should expect a nice breakout this year for Drake London. Moving on to the next wide receiver, Tank Dell. He had a chance to really go nuts last year, but his year got cut short due to injury. It's an injury that we should keep in mind, right? Broken fibula. He seems okay, but he now has a shot at doing something special. But how special can it be while he has to compete with Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs, right? I don't think there's a world where Tank becomes the wide receiver 1 on this team without injury to the other guys, particularly Nico. Can he be the wide receiver 2 in terms of fantasy on this team? Maybe ahead of Diggs? I can see it. Not sure it's because of volume, but it can be because of some big plays and that sort of thing, right? Remember, even during Diggs' lull, once Joe Brady took over as Bills' offensive coordinator, Diggs still had an elite 29% target share during that span. So for a huge breakout to happen for Dell, I'm not sure I see that for him this year. I think he can definitely finish top 20. So him just having maybe 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns, that will be just fine for where he's being drafted, and I'd consider that a breakout. But I don't think those are the high-end expectations for Tank this year. But I think that is on the high end of what the expectations should be for Tank Dell this year, given his competition and given the fact that I do think Diggs and Nico will both out-target him this year. Now, I want to talk about Hollywood Brown and whether he can have a breakout season. Believe it or not, he's only had one 1,000-yard season, barely, with Baltimore in 2021. I think there's a decent chance it happens again this year with the Chiefs. He's had quarterback issues both years in Arizona. He was stuck on an extremely slow, low-volume passing offense in Baltimore, and now he'll be in an up-tempo, pass-first offense with the best quarterback in the NFL. He definitely has target competition, but I think his talent and his ability matches what the Chiefs want to do on offense, and he's going to be a big part of the reason Mahomes will start to sling it much further down the field, something he couldn't do much of over the last 2 seasons, because he just didn't have that threat. Now they have several threats in the middle of the field, a couple of threats downfield, and teams are just going to have to pick their poison. I think Hollywood benefits in a huge way. I also believe that Rashee Rice will have a big year as well when he's on the field, but because Hollywood has a chance to be there for every game, he could end up being an every week wide receiver too. Maybe with some volatility, of course, given their multitude of weapons, but I don't see them taking Hollywood off the field a whole lot this year. Outside of his rookie year, he was a pretty solid target earner, 22% or higher every year since. Even 20% would amount to 120 targets on this offense, which I would take all day long from Patrick Mahomes. Moving on to the next receiver, will Jaxon Smith-Njigba break out this year? There are a few reasons he can. One, Tyler Lockett is going into his age 32 season. He scored his lowest fantasy points per game since 2017. Last year was the first year he finished outside the top 36 since 2017. He scored less fantasy points than his expected fantasy points per game number, which is unlike him. I don't think new pass-happy OC Ryan Grubb is coming in and saying we have to build this around Tyler Lockett right now. I think JSN's going to be schemed up a ton. Now going back to Washington with Ryan Grubb, among 43 wide receivers to get at least 50 slot targets last year in the Power 5, Huskies slot wide receiver Jaylen McMillan was 11th in yards per route run, 11th in average depth of target, and 7th in passer rating generated in Grubb's offense. Grubb compared JSN to the type of role and skill set that Jalen Polk had. Grubb had a lot of comparisons, to that role, but also to the skill set that Jalen Polk had, which is really great to hear because we could see some more stuff in the intermediate part of the field, which would be very welcome after a very low 6.4 average depth of target for JSN last year, and some potential for some option routes, which would really give JSN an advantage against slot defenders. I think JSN's skill set coming into the league aligns really well with what Grubb wants to do on offense, and this is part of the reason why I can't find myself selling in Dynasty. But I think 63 catches on 93 targets for 628 yards and 4 touchdowns isn't a terrible rookie year, especially considering the fact that he missed very valuable time with a broken wrist and then wrist surgery at the end of the offseason last year, and also not having a full-time role. Only 6 times over 80% route participation last year, only 63% of the time with the Seahawks in 3 wide receiver sets, compared to 80% for Grubb at Washington. I think JSN and DK Metcalf will have big years. I'm targeting Metcalf heavy as well, but Grubb has experience working with 3 very good wide receivers and keeping them all productive. And Geno Smith, man, he's still a very good quarterback. I think he's being a little bit undervalued this year. He's very good under pressure. He's very accurate. He's been really good at, on the deep ball, accuracy on the deep ball over the last 2 seasons. This is going to be a good offense in Seattle in 2024. All right, all this leads to George Pickens. I think many are projecting a big breakout year for him this season because Deontay Johnson is gone. And I think there is definitely a ton of merit to that statement. Deontay was a true target earner, an elite separator, etc., etc. You know my love for Deontay at this point. In 4 games without Deontay in his career, Pickens has averaged 8.3 targets, 89 29.3 receiving yards, and 16.6 fantasy points per game. That fantasy points per game number, that's the mark of a top 12 wide receiver right there. But one thing to keep in mind is that it was a sample of only 4 games, and he averaged only 4.3 receptions during those games. I think a breakout is 100% a potential outcome for George Pickens this year. His first 2 years cumulatively have been great. 800 yards, 1,140 yards the last 2 seasons, 52 catches, and 63 catches though, okay? 2.25 yards per route run was awesome. 16th among all wide receivers with 100 plus targets last year. First downs per route run, which kind of gives you an idea of whether guys were being targeted all over the field and not just downfield. 6th worst last year. He was a big play guy, and it's very possible he remains a big play guy. Can a big play guy have a big year, breakout year? Of course, especially with a quarterback upgrade, right? Who specifically does well throwing down the field. Russell Wilson was 8th in deep passer rating among qualifying quarterbacks. Kenny Pickett ranked 33rd of 38 quarterbacks who qualified last year. But another thing about Russell Wilson, among qualifying quarterbacks last year, he was dead last in percentage of his throws targeting his first read last year. Pickens should be the first read on most plays, but the whole point is we want him to get the target volume. And by the way, I didn't even mention Arthur Smith. Drake London had a 22% target share last year, and now we're drafting him as a low-end wide receiver 1. 22% target share is high-end wide receiver 3 type of target share. What will Pickens' target share actually look like? Courtland Sutton had a 19% target share last year. He probably would have had an even higher target share if Russell Wilson actually threw to his first read at an average rate. What I don't know is if Pickens is a high-volume, true wide receiver 1 in the NFL, right? I would lean towards no on that as of right now, but I do think he can mesh well with Russell Wilson if all goes well, and he can break out if all goes well. But I think we might have to temper some expectations if we're expecting this like 1,400-yard season from him, and if we're putting him in the same sentence as wide receivers like Drake London and Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson and guys who have underperformed, but we know are good wide receivers, right? And they're just a good quarterback or good system away from being truly elite in way more fashions than just making plays downfield. I've seen people put him in that category. Like, he could get there, and I'm not sure I see that personally. Is a 1,200-yard season with 8 to 10 touchdowns possible for Pickens this year? Yeah. But I think it is possible also that he might be in line for more of the same of what we've seen already. Maybe more touchdowns this time around, right? Maybe closer to 8 or 9 than the 4 or 5 we've seen over the last 2 years, which could turn out to be pretty damn good and very good for fantasy. 900 yards to 1,000 yards, maybe 8 or 9 touchdowns. I'll take it, right? But it might just be a bit of a bumpy ride. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for watching. Quarterbacks and tight ends coming up very soon. Peace.